Imagine the scene. You are awakened by the grating clamor of concrete mixers obliterating a creek that has meandered behind your house since before the Civil War. The scent of diesel fumes blended with pulverized limestone invades your senses as you witness $80,000 of your homeowner association fees being poured into what was once a pristine mountain stream. It's for the purpose of flood control. HOA President Brenda Hartwell declares smugly from her white Tesla. What this real estate agent was unaware of? I am a retired hydrologist from the Army Corps of Engineers, and she had just set a ticking time bomb. Let's jump ahead 6 months. Brenda's million-dollar residence is submerged in 2 feet of murky swamp water, its foundation splitting. While my modest property remains perfectly dry, the FBI is at her front door, and the concrete channel she was so pleased with is on the verge of costing her everything. How would you react if your HOA misappropriated your money to ruin your tranquility? Where are you all tuning in from? I'd wager your own neighbors have attempted something equally senseless. My name is Dale Brennan, I'm 58 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I believed the greatest danger to my mental well-being was sourcing carburetor parts for a 1972 Harley Sportster. I was, it turns out, mistaken. The actual menace was an HOA board president who mistook a real estate license for a doctorate in hydroengineering. I came into my grandfather's 2-acre piece of heaven in what was once rural Colorado. Back in the days when Willowbrook was little more than cattle grazing land and the only HOA was a herd of Angus, my grandfather, William Brennan, served as a combat engineer who made it through Normandy and returned to create something magnificent. This creek was his solace. For 3 years since my retirement from the Army Corps of Engineers, I had performed the same ritual each morning. I'd have coffee on the back porch, heeding the murmur of Cottonwood Creek as it flowed over smooth granite rocks, the fragrance of motor oil from my workshop mingling with damp willow bark, and the sound of my hammering carrying across the crystal-clear water at sunrise. My boots would make a crunching sound on the gravel walkways my grandfather meticulously laid by hand in 1948. Martha, my spouse of 26 years, is a 4th-grade teacher possessing the patience of a saint, a quality she would desperately need for the events to come. Our children have dispersed like seeds in the wind. Jessica is saving lives as a Portland trauma nurse, while Mike is debugging code in Austin. Both of them inherited their grandfather's determined nature, the thing that made our land. So unique wasn't the 1950s ranch-style house or my disorganized workshop brimming with classic motorcycle components. It was 400 yards of creek frontage accompanied by water rights that dated back to 1873. These rights were older than the state of Colorado, more ancient than electric lighting, and certainly older than suburban princesses with personality issues. Then Willowbrook Estates arrived, springing up around us like high-priced fungi after a downpour. It consisted of 47 houses with an average price of $900,000, mostly populated by California transplants escaping their own HOA calamities. The irony was heavier than the morning fog on the creek. And then came our antagonist, Brenda Hartwell, 52, the HOA board president and self-proclaimed empress of suburban flawlessness, recently arrived from Marin County with that distinct mix of entitlement and ignorance that stems only from selling overpriced homes to desperate buyers. She drove a white Tesla with vanity plates that read, "Sold for you." And she sported pearl earrings like they were pieces of battle armor. Her husband is some investment banker who travels to Denver for work. Their children go to a private school where they were likely taught that individuals like me are economically disadvantaged instead of having simply chosen different life priorities. Their $1.2 million colonial-style home backs directly onto my creek, its manicured lawn stopping precisely where true nature starts. The initial salvo was fired on a Tuesday morning that smelled of fresh coffee and looming legal expenses. An official HOA violation notice arrived via certified mail. Unsightly storage of automotive parts visible from neighboring properties violates community aesthetic standards. The fine was $200 per day until compliance was achieved. I read it over twice, the legal absurdity of it all seeping in like creek water into parched earth. Here is what Brenda's high-priced attorneys failed to notice. My property was established 80 years before their HOA. My grandfather's deed encompassed mineral rights, water rights, and a grandfathered exemption from any future development limitations, but they were gambling that this old mechanic wouldn't be familiar with fundamental property law. The in-person meeting proceeded just as one might anticipate. Brenda's office was filled with the sense of vanilla candles and self-importance. With the practiced smile that real estate agents perfect in front of expensive mirrors, she suggested that I might be more content somewhere with more lenient property regulations. The translation was clear. A place where poor people belong, I replied with a certified letter clarifying that HOA covenants are not applicable to grandfathered properties. It's basic real estate law, one of the first things you learn when handling water rights and easements. Her response was immediate and costly. Anonymous complaints were filed with the county regarding illegal business activities because it seems fixing motorcycles appears suspicious to individuals who hire others to change their car's oil. A building inspector spent 2 hours meticulously examining my workshop, finding nothing amiss except for my method of organization. This still set me back $1,200 in legal fees to prove I wasn't operating a chop shop. But that was merely Brenda testing the waters, in both a literal and figurative sense. The genuine madness commenced when she found out my water rights were a complex matter in Colorado. Water is synonymous with power, and in Brenda's universe, people like me, with calloused hands and grandfathered land, are not deserving of either. It was then I understood this was not about motorcycle parts. This was a war. The spring snowmelt was flowing heavily that year, and Cottonwood Creek's song was louder than usual as it cascaded over the Beaver Dam situated 100 yards upstream. The sound of swift water moving over granite blended with the aroma of damp willow bark and the morning mist that rose from the water's surface. It should have been a tranquil scene. Instead, it provided the score for Brenda's next clever legal tactic. She had done her research this time, or so she believed, and had engaged Peyton and Associates, a Denver law firm specializing in what they euphemistically termed environmental property disputes, which is legal jargon for creative methods to financially ruin your neighbors by exploiting government regulations. Their approach was elegant in its cruelty. File a nuisance water flow complaint with the county, alleging that my property was generating hazardous runoff that posed a threat to those valuable million-dollar homes downstream. The legal documents were delivered on a Thursday morning, as thick as a Denver phone book and just about as helpful. They contained 57 pages of technical language that essentially communicated: force the old man to prove his 150-year-old creek won't inundate our clients' McMansions. They aimed to compel me to undertake a $50,000 environmental impact study. You are familiar with the type. It takes 2 years to complete and necessitates hiring the very same consultants who likely play golf with their attorneys on weekends. That evening, Martha discovered me standing knee-deep in the creek, my boots squelching in the muddy bank as I measured flow patterns with my grandfather's old surveyor's rod. "What are you thinking about?" she inquired, using that elementary school teacher tone which indicated she could sense trouble on the horizon. "I'm thinking Brenda's high-priced lawyers just made a $50,000 error," I replied, observing the water eddy around a boulder my grandfather had manually placed in 1953. "And I'm thinking they chose the wrong retired engineer to challenge. You see, there is something I picked up during my 30 years with the Army Corps. Lawyers are fond of complex-sounding environmental regulations because they operate under the assumption that ordinary people won't grasp them. What they fail to remember is that some of us were the ones who actually engineered the systems they are attempting to regulate. It's akin to having someone explain to you how your own car engine functions. When you are the person who constructed it, I contacted my former colleague, Pete Morrison, at the Colorado Water Authority. It took him precisely 10 minutes to identify what Peyton and Associates had overlooked. They had founded their entire legal grievance on watershed maps from 1967. This was before the interstate was constructed, before half of the subdivisions upstream came into existence, and before modern storm drainage systems had altered every flow pattern in the valley. "Dale," Pete said with a chuckle over the phone, "these maps illustrate creek behavior that hasn't been seen since Nixon was president. Would you like me to forward you the current surveys? This is going to be quite embarrassing for them." The contemporary geological data presented a completely different narrative. Far from creating issues, my portion of the creek actually served to prevent flooding by forming a natural retention area during the spring runoff. Those granite boulders that my grandfather had positioned were not merely for aesthetic purposes. The old combat engineer had constructed a flood control system long before most people were familiar with the term. But here is where the situation became truly fascinating. Back in engineering school, we were taught about something known as the prior appropriation doctrine. In essence, Colorado water law operates on a first-come, first-served basis. Since my family had records of water usage dating back to 1873, our rights superseded any that were filed subsequent to that date, which included Brenda's entire subdivision, her HOA, and likely even the future grievances of her great-grandchildren. I dedicated that weekend to my workshop, encircled by my grandfather's engineering notebooks and up-to-date county survey maps, piecing together the connections that Brenda's legal team had entirely failed to see. The familiar scent of motor oil, mingled with that of old paper, accompanied by the scratching sound of a pencil on graph paper. It felt as though I was channeling the spirit of the old man, and perhaps I was. On Monday morning, I lodged my own complaint with the county. It was not simply a defense, but a counteroffensive. I insisted that Brenda's group finance a proper environmental assessment, given that their legal persecution was founded on fraudulent information. I also attached Pete's analysis, which demonstrated how their prize development had, in fact, heightened the flood risk for everyone situated downstream. The county water commissioner, a man named Rodriguez, who had been handling water disputes since before Brenda had even heard of Colorado, took a single glance at my paperwork and began to laugh. "Mr. Brennan," he remarked, "these individuals just attempted to school a hydrologist on water flow using maps from the Johnson administration. This may very well be the briefest water rights case in the history of the state." 2 weeks later, I was completely vindicated. The county ruled in my favor on every single point, directed the HOA to halt all water-related harassment, and formally recognized my historical water rights. All at once, my claims were not merely grandfathered. They were etched in legal stone. However, this victory brought with it some noteworthy consequences. The local newspaper published the story. HOA challenges century-old water rights, loses spectacularly. Neighbors I had never previously met began to show up at my workshop door, sharing their own Brenda horror stories. Citations for non-compliant mailboxes, penalties for unapproved garden ornaments, and threats concerning inappropriate exterior paint choices. That evening, Martha found me by the creek as the sun was setting, holding my grandfather's fishing rod, but with no real plan to fish. "This is where he educated me about water," I explained to her, "how it invariably seeks the path of least resistance, yet never ceases its journey toward its destination." "And where is this particular water destined to go?" she inquired. I smiled, listening to Cottonwood Creek as it murmured over stones that were older than Brenda's entire lineage by several geological eras, flowing directly through the heart of her flawless little empire. One might assume that losing a water rights dispute would instill a sense of humility. One would be mistaken. Brenda Hartwell had evidently graduated from the school of thought that advocates for doubling down on poor decisions, because her subsequent action was so audacious it genuinely impressed me. In a terrifying, watching someone leap off a cliff while proclaiming their constitutional right to fly sort of way. 3 weeks after the county instructed her to cease her actions, Brenda convened an emergency HOA board meeting. Naturally, she arranged it for the 1 week Martha and I had scheduled a vacation to see Jessica in Portland, our first genuine holiday since this entire ordeal began. The meeting notification was mailed to our address from 2 moves prior, guaranteeing that we would be unable to voice any objections to whatever new form of madness she was devising. The agenda item appeared harmless. Emergency. Flood mitigation assessment. What transpired, however, was Brenda showcasing doctored photographs that depicted severe erosion damage to HOA property. Pictures that looked suspiciously as if they were taken after she had hired someone to excavate holes near the creek with a backhoe. She asserted that her engineering consultant, an individual who later proved to be her cousin's landscaping contractor, had concluded that immediate concrete channeling was essential to avert catastrophic property damage. The motion was approved with a 6-1 vote, with only Edwin Kowalski dissenting. Edwin telephoned me in Portland that evening, his Polish accent heavy with contempt. "Dale, this woman, she is a crazy person. She claims a flood will ruin everything if we don't pour concrete into your creek." She presented pictures. "But something smells like fish that has been left in the sun for too long." A special assessment of $1,800 per homeowner was levied for emergency flood control infrastructure. The total cost of the project was $127,000 for what any genuine engineer could have informed them was entirely superfluous. But Brenda had discovered her golden hammer, and all of a sudden, every issue resembled a nail in need of a concrete solution. I curtailed our vacation and drove back home through the night, with Martha sleeping restlessly in the passenger seat while I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and tried to estimate how much destruction they could inflict in 72 hours. The answer, as it happened, was a significant amount. The sound was the first thing to hit me. Jackhammers and diesel engines rumbling where the songs of mourning birds once resided. Then came the smell, concrete dust intermingling with destroyed plant life, and diesel exhaust lingering in the valley like an industrial haze. As I turned the corner onto my driveway, I witnessed what Brenda had done to 150 years of natural splendor. My creek had vanished. In its stead was a hideous concrete trough that resembled a drainage ditch from a prison. The clear mountain water that once gracefully flowed over smooth stones now coursed through an 18-inch deep gray channel that would be more at home in an urban wasteland than in the Colorado mountains. They had encased my grandfather's meticulously placed boulders under tons of concrete, annihilating fish spawning grounds that had been there since before Colorado was even a state. Martha stood beside me, tears cascading down her cheeks. "They've killed it?" she whispered. "They actually managed to kill a living creek? But here's the thing about being a hydrologist who has dedicated 3 decades to navigating environmental regulations. You develop the ability to think like water, and water, in the end, always uncovers the truth." I dedicated the following week to meticulously documenting everything. Photographs taken from every conceivable angle, measurements of water flow, and samples collected for chemical analysis. More significantly, I conducted research on Pinnacle Construction, the firm that had carried out the work. It transpired they had a rather notorious history. 3 EPA violations in the span of 5 years, fines totaling $75,000 for unauthorized modifications to waterways, and a recurring habit of commencing work before the necessary permits had been granted, because here is a fact that every property owner ought to be aware of. Any substantial alteration to a natural waterway necessitates approval from the county, the state environmental agency, and, frequently, the EPA. It's like a legal 3-tiered cake, and you must obtain permission for each and every layer. Brenda's team had bypassed all 3. The Clean Water Act is not to be taken lightly when it comes to unauthorized concrete and the destruction of fish habitats. I had encountered cases where offenders faced fines of $25,000 per day, and that was solely at the federal level. Colorado's Environmental Protection Agency could impose an additional $10,000 daily. The calculation was straightforward. Every single day that concrete remained in position represented another $35,000 in potential penalties. I submitted complaints to every agency with jurisdiction: County Code Enforcement, State Environmental Protection, and the EPA's Region 8 office located in Denver. Following that, I contacted the local Trout Unlimited chapter, whose president nearly suffered a stroke when I detailed what had been done to the spawning habitats. "Mr. Brennan," he stated, "this is precisely the type of habitat destruction we have been combating for the past 20 years. We will furnish you with whatever assistance you require. Legal, financial, or expert witnesses, these individuals have just waged war on every fish in the state of Colorado." The counteroffensive was both swift and thorough. Within a span of 10 days, I had 3 distinct government agencies conducting investigations: a legal clinic specializing in environmental law from the University of Colorado providing pro bono representation, and a volume of documentation sufficient to bury Payton and Associates in their own legal papers. But Brenda was not done yet. Edwin Kowalski alerted me that she was already orchestrating the next phase of escalation: a comprehensive flood control system that would encase the entire creek in concrete, from the county road to the boundary of the subdivision. Her justification was, if we're going to undertake this, we might as well do it properly. That evening, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by my grandfather's engineering notebooks, poring over his 1950s photographs of the natural creek system. The old combat engineer had engineered something magnificent that had functioned flawlessly for 70 years without a single flooding event. Brenda had obliterated it in a mere 3 days, but in doing so, she had also provided me with enough federal violations to potentially send her to prison. If you've ever pondered what desperation smells like, it is a combination of vanilla candles and nervous sweat in a real estate office at 7:00 a.m. This is where I found myself 3 weeks later, seated opposite Brenda Hartwell as she attempted to persuade me that black was, in fact, white, and that concrete was a natural substance. "Dale," she began, pushing a manila envelope across her glass-topped desk, "I believe we may have started off on the wrong foot. This entire affair has been most unfortunate." Inside the envelope lay a cashier's check for $500,000, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement that was thicker than my grandfather's engineering textbook. The proposition was straightforward and blatantly illegal. Accept the money, pledge never to speak publicly about the creek situation, and move out of the county within a 6-month period. Oh, and also transfer my water rights to the HOA for proper management. The implied threat was barely concealed. Legal disputes are costly, Dale. Even when you are victorious, you still suffer losses. Consider Martha's job stability. I had brought with me a small digital recorder, which is perfectly legal in Colorado with single-party consent, and Brenda's subsequent words were pure gold. If you refuse this offer, I will see to it that every property owner in this valley is aware that you are an anti-development extremist who is attempting to diminish property values. My connections in real estate are extensive, and your wife's teaching career could face complications. During that same week, my workshop was vandalized once more. On this occasion, they were not trying to be subtle. Vintage motorcycle parts were strewn across the floor, tools had been stolen, and my restored 1972 Sportster was toppled over. With sugar poured into its gas tank, however, they had made an error. The new security cameras I had installed captured the entire event, including a distinct image of a white Tesla parked at the end of my driveway at 2:00 a.m. The psychological campaign intensified on a daily basis. Anonymous online reviews began to surface from Martha's after-school tutoring service. Unprofessional, political agenda, do not entrust your children to radicals. An individual contacted her principal to express concerns regarding her suitability as a teacher. The pressure was taking a toll on both of us. Martha was experiencing sleepless nights, and I was monitoring my blood pressure twice a day. But here's something Brenda failed to grasp about engineers. We are methodical. Every single threat, every instance of vandalism, and every anonymous complaint was documented with the same level of precision as a federal inquiry. Because that is precisely what it was evolving into. The EPA had initiated a formal case file. The Office of the Colorado Attorney General had dispatched investigators. Local environmental organizations were treating this incident as the Suburban Creek equivalent of the Exxon Valdez disaster, and I was accumulating allies at a faster rate than Brenda was creating adversaries. Sarah Olivia, a third-year environmental law student at the University of Colorado, had taken on my case as her senior thesis. While sifting through the HOA's financial documents, she had uncovered something noteworthy. A recurring pattern of overpriced contracts with firms that had enigmatic ties to Brenda's real estate network. Mr. Brennan, she stated, laying out papers across my workshop table. This concrete project was billed at $127,000 for work that should have cost $40,000 at most. The surplus was funneled into consulting fees and emergency contractor surcharges, all of which can be traced back to companies owned by Brenda's business associates. The young woman had discovered irrefutable evidence where I had only harbored suspicions. Board meetings conducted in secrecy, contracts awarded without a competitive bidding process, and special assessments being utilized to finance personal vendettas. What had commenced as environmental vandalism was increasingly appearing to be organized fraud. However, the most significant revelation was found within my grandfather's engineering notebooks. While conducting research on the original creek design, I had come across his 1973 consulting report for the county, a document that foretold with exact precision what was currently unfolding. He had issued a warning against the use of concrete channeling in this particular area, having calculated that it would elevate the risk of downstream flooding by 300% during the spring runoff. The report contained comprehensive flowcharts, seasonal water tables, and soil absorption rates. All factors that Brenda's engineering consultant had disregarded. More critically, it served as proof that someone with genuine engineering qualifications had already examined this issue 50 years prior and had arrived at the exact opposite conclusion to that of Brenda's landscaper. It was then that I comprehended the beautiful irony of the circumstances. Brenda believed she was addressing a flooding issue, but she had, in fact, constructed a hydraulic time bomb. The spring snowmelt was a mere 6 weeks away, and the concrete channel was set to funnel every single drop of water directly towards the foundations of the HOA homes. The natural creek had previously meandered across my property, spreading its flow over a broad floodplain that soaked up surplus water like a sponge. The concrete channel had done away with this natural absorption, fashioning a high-pressure water cannon aimed squarely at million-dollar basements. I dedicated that weekend to my calculator, my grandfather's flowcharts, and the latest weather forecasts. The calculations were both alarming and magnificent. When the spring floods arrived, and they were predicted to be severe that year, Brenda's concrete solution would transform a controllable water flow into a torrent capable of destroying foundations. My property, situated upstream and at a naturally higher elevation, would remain completely dry. The HOA homes, located downstream from the concrete channel, were destined to flood as if they were submarines equipped with screen doors. Edwin Kowalski paid a visit that Sunday evening and found me at my kitchen table, sketching out restoration plans. "Dale," he remarked, "this woman Brenda, She is making a very big mistake. Yes. I glanced at the weather service predictions, which indicated a heavy snowpack and a wet spring to come, and then at my grandfather's engineering calculations, which proved with certainty what would occur when the laws of physics encountered sheer foolishness. Edwin, I stated. She just built the most expensive lawsuit in the world. The creek was about to exact its revenge with compound interest. Sarah Olivia showed up at my workshop on a bleak February morning, carrying a banker's box filled with papers and wearing an expression that suggested someone was in for a very unpleasant day. Fortunately, it wasn't me. Mr. Brennan, she announced, placing the box on my workbench with a firm thud. I believe you will want to be seated for this. For the past 3 weeks, Sarah had been engaged in what she termed forensic accounting of the HOA's financial records, essentially tracing the flow of money with the tenacity of a bloodhound holding a CPA license. Her discoveries would have brought tears of joy to the FBI's white-collar crime division. The concrete project, which had cost the homeowners $127,000, was for work that was actually valued at approximately $40,000. The remaining $87,000 had vanished into a complex web of consulting fees, emergency contractor surcharges, and environmental assessment expenses, all of which ultimately led back to companies with suspiciously recognizable names. Hartwell Property Consulting, Willowbrook Environmental Solutions. Brenda was not only destroying my creek. She was also brazenly stealing from her own neighbors in the process, but that was merely the prelude. The main event occurred when Edwin Kowalski entered my workshop 20 minutes later, holding a small digital recorder as if it contained the secrets of the cosmos. Which, in a sense, it did. Dale, he said, his Polish accent thick with justified indignation. You recall I informed you that I voted against the concrete project? I may have neglected to mention that I recorded the entire meeting. The recording was absolutely damning. Brenda's voice, as clear as mountain water, could be heard explaining to the board that the true objective was not flood control, but rather to oust incompatible residents who do not comprehend our community vision. She had openly discussed utilizing HOA funds to entangle me in costly legal disputes, fully aware that most individuals lack the financial resources to resist. The most revealing part was her confession that the concrete project was not intended to prevent floods, but to eradicate anything that gave the neighborhood a rural or working-class appearance. She aimed to eliminate every vestige of the area's ranching past in order to enhance property values for her real estate enterprise. However, the true bombshell was concealed within my grandfather's engineering files. While sifting through his documents for the legal case, I had discovered a folder labeled Willowbrook Development Consultation, 1973. Inside was a comprehensive hydrological analysis he had conducted for the county, in which he cautioned against any form of concrete channeling in this precise area. His calculations were both exact and prescient. The use of concrete channeling would eradicate the natural flood absorption capabilities of the creek bed, thereby directing the entirety of the spring runoff towards the downstream development zone. During years with heavy snowmelt, such as the current one, the outcome would be devastating foundation flooding for any residences constructed within the natural floodplain, which was the exact location of Brenda's house. The engineering report featured detailed topographical maps that clearly showed my property was situated at a naturally higher elevation, above the flood zone, whereas the HOA development was built in the traditional overflow area. My grandfather had, in fact, advised against construction in that location, but developers in the 1990s had disregarded his warnings. Reading his carefully penned notes felt like receiving a communication from beyond the grave. The creek will eventually reclaim its floodplain. Concrete will only serve to enrage it when it does. Sarah arranged the financial evidence across my workbench as I presented my grandfather's engineering forecasts. The pattern was unmistakable. Brenda had misappropriated nearly $90,000 from her neighbors to construct a flood-inducing device that would ultimately destroy their homes while ensuring mine remained safe. This constitutes conspiracy, fraud, environmental destruction, and potentially racketeering, Sarah declared, sorting the documents into orderly legal stacks. The EPA violations alone could land her in federal prison. When you factor in the financial offenses, she is facing a significant amount of time. Martha joined us for coffee, examining the evidence with the discerning eye of a teacher, skilled at identifying patterns. She played herself? She remarked quietly. Every action she took to cause us harm actually generated more evidence against her. Outside, The February snow was melting at a faster rate than usual, and Cottonwood Creek was beginning to run high within its concrete confinement. Weather service forecasts were predicting the most substantial spring runoff in 2 decades. Brenda had constructed a ticking time bomb for herself and had simultaneously provided me with the evidence needed to convict her when it inevitably detonated. The only remaining question was whether I should alert her neighbors to the impending danger or allow the laws of physics to deliver the lesson that my grandfather's engineering had foretold 50 years ago. My workshop had been repurposed from a place for restoring motorcycles into what resembled a strategic command center. Conceived by engineers who had perhaps seen too many spy films, every available surface was laden with maps, legal papers, financial statements, and my grandfather's engineering schematics. The coffee maker was in constant operation, the landline rang incessantly, and Martha had taken to providing platters of sandwiches for the continuous flow of supporters arriving at our doorstep. The restoration of my 1972 Harley Sportster, now finally finished, stood in a corner. A testament to resurrecting the inanimate, which felt fitting given our plans for the creek. Kate Morrison, the environmental attorney from the University of Colorado's legal clinic, had formally taken on my case pro bono upon reviewing Sarah's financial findings. Kate was the type of lawyer who preferred to battle polluters over chasing ambulances, and she tackled environmental law with the strategic mind of a grandmaster chess player holding a grudge. Dale, she stated, unfurling a timeline across my workbench, we are not merely contending with one case here. We are engaged in 4 distinct legal conflicts at once, and we are going to prevail in all of them. The approach was sophisticated in its intricacy. A federal case concerning Clean Water Act violations and unauthorized habitat destruction. A state case involving water rights infringement and environmental permit fraud. A county case addressing building code violations and improper special assessments. And a civil case for fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each case bolstered the others, creating overlapping fields of attack. Even if Brenda managed to win a single battle, the other 3 would overwhelm her, and due to a legal principle Kate referred to as the private attorney general doctrine. We could recoup all legal expenses if we were victorious. Environmental law, in fact, encourages private citizens to sue offenders when government agencies are unable to keep up with enforcement. The financial inquiry had blossomed into something both magnificent and alarming. Sarah had brought on 2 additional law students and a professor of forensic accounting who viewed HOA fraud as a particularly captivating puzzle. They unearthed that Brenda's practice of awarding inflated contracts had been ongoing for 3 years, encompassing landscaping, security systems, and legal consulting services, all of which could be traced back to her business associates. The total estimated misappropriation was over $200,000 from homeowner assessments. This was no longer just a matter of civil fraud. It had escalated into the realm of federal racketeering, where prison terms are counted in years, not months. In the meantime, I was designing the restoration of the creek, utilizing my grandfather's original surveys in conjunction with modern environmental engineering principles. The natural channel design would not only prevent flooding but also restore the fish habitat, all for a total cost of approximately $35,000. Less than half of what Brenda had squandered on her concrete catastrophe. Colorado Trout Unlimited had pledged $25,000 towards the restoration fund, and the Sierra Club contributed an additional $15,000. Local fishing clubs, environmental organizations, and even some remorseful HOA members were making donations to what we had begun to call the Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project. The community mobilization had taken on a momentum of its own. Weekly gatherings in my workshop attracted 30 to 40 individuals, among them veterans who admired the sight of a combat engineer's grandson confronting bureaucratic folly. Martha managed the social media efforts. Hashtag Save Cottonwood Creek had amassed over 5,000 followers and was still expanding. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, from the Environmental Engineering Department at Colorado State, had offered her services as our expert witness. She had examined my grandfather's 1973 forecasts and validated them using contemporary computer modeling. The concrete channel would heighten the flood risk by 400% during periods of heavy spring runoff, channeling all of that water directly towards the foundations of the HOA homes. Your grandfather was 50 years ahead of his time, she informed me as she studied his hand-drawn flowcharts. This is precisely how we design natural flood control systems today. Brenda didn't merely destroy a creek. She dismantled a sophisticated engineering system that had been safeguarding the entire valley. The media approach was managed through Kate's office. Local journalists were drawn to the David versus Goliath narrative. But we were deliberate in our efforts to emphasize environmental preservation rather than personal retaliation. The story was beginning to extend beyond Colorado, appearing in environmental law blogs, fishing publications, and even being featured by a documentary team from Denver Public Television. However, our most potent weapon remained my grandfather's historical documentation. His photographs from the 1950s provided a clear record of how the natural creek had managed spring floods for decades without causing any damage to property. These images would serve as powerful visual evidence in a court of law, demonstrating that the concrete had, in fact, created the flood risk rather than mitigating it. The Weather Service predictions were confirming our most dire projections: a substantial snowpack in the Rockies, spring temperatures that were warmer than usual, and several storm systems converging on our location during the peak snowmelt period. The concrete channel was about to undergo its first significant trial, and it was destined to fail in a spectacular fashion. Edwin Kowalski had become our internal source of information, providing updates on the increasingly frantic HOA board meetings where the remaining members were beginning to express alarm over their legal exposure. 3 board members had already stepped down, asserting they had been deceived about the project's lawfulness. The sequence of events was unfolding more rapidly than the spring snowmelt. The federal EPA had officially launched an investigation. The county district attorney had declared a criminal inquiry into the financial management of the HOA. The state environmental agency had issued emergency cease and desist orders, and multiple class action lawsuits had been initiated by other victims of HOA misconduct throughout Colorado. Martha and I would spend our evenings strolling along the concrete-ravaged creek, making plans for its renewal. The sound of water struggling against man-made barriers, the smell of curing concrete in the mountain atmosphere. It was an ugly but fleeting scene. "How much longer until we can revive it?" she inquired. I considered the seasonal flooding, legal schedules, and construction timelines. "By this time next spring, this creek will be more beautiful than Grandfather could have ever dreamed, provided we make it through this spring first." Desperation carries a distinct scent. A mixture of vanilla air freshener, anxious perspiration, and the sharp, acrid smell of bridges being set ablaze by an individual too obstinate to concede defeat. This was the atmosphere that pervaded Brenda's real estate office at 6 to 47 a.m. on March 3rd, when she summoned me for an urgent meeting that felt more akin to a hostage negotiation. "Dale," she began, pushing yet another envelope across her glass desk. "I have been contemplating our circumstances. Perhaps we can arrive at a mutually advantageous resolution." The envelope held a cashier's check for $750,000 and a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive it would have impressed the CIA. The terms were to take the money, move out of Colorado, sign over my water rights to a conservation trust overseen by the HOA, and maintain a perpetual public silence on matters of creek restoration, environmental law, or HOA governance. The underlying threat was thinly veiled. "Legal disputes can tear families apart, Dale. Inquire with Martha about how her teaching career would fare if the school board were to learn of her husband's radical environmental activities." I had once again brought my digital recorder, which is perfectly permissible in Colorado, and Brenda's subsequent words were a prosecutor's dream. "If you decline this final offer, I will personally see to it that every contractor, every supplier, and every business owner in this valley knows you are a troublemaker who costs people money, your wife's tutoring service, your motorcycle hobby, your reputation. All of it can be made to vanish. I possess connections you cannot even fathom." That very evening, my workshop was targeted once more. This time, their actions were not merely theft. They were conveying a message. My fully restored Harley was knocked over, its frame bent, destroying 40 hours of restoration work in a matter of minutes. My grandfather's original engineering notebooks were strewn across the floor, some pages ripped, others saturated with motor oil. However, they had made a critical error: the upgraded security system I had installed following the initial break-in recorded the entire event in high-definition color. 2 individuals in hooded sweatshirts systematically vandalizing my property, and then a white Tesla with unmistakable vanity plates collecting them at 2:17 a.m. One of the vandals was sporting a pair of $300 sneakers that were identical to a pair I had seen on Brenda's 17-year-old son. The psychological campaign escalated to a level befitting a corporate espionage thriller. Anonymous reviews inundated Martha's tutoring business. Unprofessional conduct, political indoctrination, unsafe environment for children. Someone fabricated false social media profiles to disseminate lies about my military record, alleging I had been dishonorably discharged due to mental instability and a history of violent behavior towards authority figures. The school principal summoned Martha for a concerned conversation regarding complaints about her husband's increasingly unpredictable conduct. 3 parents withdrew their children from her tutoring sessions after they received anonymous letters cautioning them about dangerous political extremists within the education system. But here is the fundamental thing Brenda failed to comprehend about engineers. We meticulously document everything, every threat, every instance of vandalism, and every anonymous complaint was meticulously filed in a system that would have garnered the admiration of federal investigators. Because that is precisely who they had become. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit had initiated a formal investigation into the HOA's financial fraud. Agent Tom Rodriguez from the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division was constructing a case centered on the environmental infractions. Sarah Olivia's forensic accounting had furnished them with a detailed guide to nearly $200,000 in misappropriated homeowner funds. The mounting pressure was evident in Brenda's increasingly unpredictable actions. Edwin Kowalski reported that she had engaged in shouting matches with 3 board members during their most recent meeting, accusing them of betraying the community vision by raising questions about legal expenditures. 2 more board members resigned, leaving only Brenda and a single loyal supporter to manage a subdivision in the throes of a complete legal collapse. Meanwhile, the spring snowmelt was accelerating at an unusual rate. March temperatures were consistently 15 degrees above the norm, and the National Weather Service had issued flood watches for the entire Front Range. Cottonwood Creek was already flowing at 150% of its usual seasonal volume. With the peak of the snowmelt still 6 weeks away, I dedicated my evenings to taking flow measurements, documenting how the concrete channel was coping with the augmented water volume. The findings were precisely what my grandfather's engineering had forecasted. Instead of allowing the excess water to spread out over the natural floodplain, the concrete was channeling 100% of the flow into a constricted, high-pressure stream aimed directly at the HOA residences. Dr. Rodriguez from Colorado State had conducted computer simulations which indicated that during the height of the flood, the water velocity within the concrete channel would reach speeds capable of compromising the stability of foundations. Insurance companies were already making inquiries about unauthorized changes to natural drainage systems, changes that could potentially nullify flood insurance coverage altogether. The support from the community had swelled beyond anything I could have anticipated. Local businesses were displaying Support Dale signs. The high school environmental club had taken on the creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans organizations were treating the situation as an assault on one of their own. Regional fishing and environmental groups had elevated my case to a symbol of grassroots opposition to corporate-style HOA oppression. But Brenda had not finished escalating the conflict. Edwin alerted me that she was plotting something desperate for the upcoming board meeting, possibly hiring private security to protect HOA assets or trying to obtain a restraining order by claiming I was a threat to community safety. That evening, Martha found me in the workshop, examining weather forecasts and my grandfather's flood calculations by the light of a lamp. "How severe is it going to be?" she inquired. I looked at the snowpack data, the flow rates of the concrete channel, and the topographical maps that pinpointed exactly where all of that pressurized water was headed. Severe enough to bring this to a permanent close, I stated, one way or another. The phone call arrived at 5:23 a.m. on March 15th, startling me from sleep with the distinct sense of urgency that signals someone's world is on the verge of collapse. It was Edwin Kowalski, speaking in a whisper as if he were engaged in espionage from his own kitchen. "Dale, you must be aware, Brenda, she is packing a moving truck, a large one, in the dead of night. Very strange activity." I quickly dressed and drove by Brenda's residence just as the rising sun was casting a golden hue upon the mountains. Indeed, a commercial moving truck was parked in her driveway as she oversaw the loading of high-end furniture, her Tesla already filled with personal belongings. The woman who had dedicated 6 months to attempting to force me out of the valley was evidently orchestrating her own tactical withdrawal, but not before one final, desperate move that was either a stroke of genius or utterly insane. Most likely a combination of both. An hour later, Sarah Olivia called with information that made my coffee taste like acid. "Mr. Brennan, Brenda has just submitted an emergency restraining order." alleging that you have been stalking her family and issuing terrorist threats against HOA property. She is requesting federal protection under anti-domestic terrorism laws. The legal documents were a tour de force of imaginative writing. According to Brenda's sworn statement, I was a disgruntled military veteran with a history of anger management problems who had been conducting surveillance on HOA families and threatening to sabotage community infrastructure. She had even attached photographs of me taking water flow measurements, presenting them as proof of suspicious reconnaissance activities. The hearing for the restraining order was set for the very same day as the peak of the spring snowmelt. A coincidence in timing that was either purely by chance or an indication that Brenda was fully aware of the dire situation she was about to face. That afternoon was marked by a level of coordination one might anticipate from a military operation. If military operations included environmental lawyers, forensic accountants, and extremely irate fish biologists, Kate Morrison came with a legal brief so substantial it could have stopped a bullet, while Dr. Rodriguez provided real-time flood modeling data that depicted a grim forecast of the impending events. Dale, Kate explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table. She is attempting to bog down the legal process until the flood season has passed. If she can secure a restraining order that keeps you away from the creek during the flood, there will be no one to document what occurs to those houses. The Weather Service had escalated its advisory to a flash flood warning. The snowpack in the high country was melting at a rate faster than anyone had anticipated, and several storm systems were converging on Colorado at the most inopportune moment. Cottonwood Creek was already flowing at 200% of its normal volume. With the peak still days away, however, Brenda had made a single, crucial miscalculation in her final act of desperation. The restraining order necessitated her appearance in federal court to testify under oath regarding her allegations, which meant she would be forced to account for her surveillance claims while prosecutors possessed recordings of her offering bribes and intimidating witnesses. Agent Park from the FBI had been methodically constructing her case for weeks, tracing the money trail through Brenda's business network with the persistence of a bloodhound equipped with a federal badge. The embezzlement charges were irrefutable. Nearly $200,000 had been stolen from homeowner assessments via fraudulent contracts and kickbacks. When you factor in the witness intimidation, the attempted bribery, and the environmental offenses, Brenda was facing a significant federal prison sentence. The evening before the hearing, I found myself in my workshop, cleaning my grandfather's service revolver. Not because I anticipated any conflict, but because certain rituals can aid in clear thinking. The creek was now a roaring torrent, the spring snowmelt transforming the concrete channel into a high-pressure water cannon aimed directly at million-dollar foundations. Martha discovered me there at midnight, studying flood forecasts by lamplight. Tomorrow will change everything, won't it? One way or another, I replied, listening to the sound of water battling against its concrete confines. Either the legal system will prevail or physics will teach the lesson. The media focus had escalated to a level typically associated with political scandals or natural disasters. Denver news outlets were making plans for live broadcasts of both the court proceedings and the flood situation. Environmental law blogs had transformed my case into a symbol of citizen resistance against corporate-style HOA oppression. The hashtag concrete versus nature was trending across the nation. Sarah had learned that Brenda's family had already acquired a home in Florida, which served as proof of a premeditated plan to flee before the legal repercussions could take hold. Bank statements revealed liquidated assets, closed accounts, and transfers designed to conceal funds from potential legal judgments. The woman was, in essence, absconding from the state while simultaneously accusing me of being a terrorist. Edwin dropped by that evening with information from the final HOA board meeting. Only Brenda and one remaining supporter had been present. While distraught homeowners were demanding clarification on flood insurance, legal responsibility, and foundation warranty issues, several families had already initiated legal action against the HOA for making unauthorized modifications that had nullified their insurance coverage. Dale, Edwin remarked, this woman, she has made an enemy of everyone. Even the people who supported the concrete project now realized she was deceiving them. The irony was impeccable. Brenda had invested months in an attempt to rally the community against me, but her own avarice and desperation had achieved the exact opposite result. She had managed to isolate herself so thoroughly that even her previous allies were now distancing themselves from the legal disaster she had created. The following day, A federal court would determine whether environmental law could shield citizens from the tyranny of an HOA. However, spring floods do not adhere to legal schedules. The laws of physics were poised to deliver their own judgment on the matter of concrete versus nature, and physics, unlike Brenda, had never lost a case. The federal courthouse in Denver was more crowded than a can of sardines on March 22nd, with an overflow of people watching live feeds in the lobby while news teams vied for the best spots outside. Judge Martha Blackwood, no relation, but a woman whose reputation for enforcing environmental law was known to induce nervous perspiration in corporate attorneys, was presiding over what the local media had termed the Creek War trial. Environmental organizations occupied half of the public seating, veterans groups took up another portion, and local families who had been engaged in their own battles with HOAs filled the remaining seats. Outside, the spring snowmelt was causing Cottonwood Creek to rise to perilous heights. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Brenda Hartwell was about to discover that karma is a dish best served with compound interest. Kate Morrison's opening remarks were delivered with surgical precision. Your Honor, this case illustrates the systematic annihilation of a century-old ecosystem, all to satisfy one woman's personal vendetta against a neighbor who refused to submit to her authority. The defendant not only flouted environmental law but also embezzled nearly $200,000 from her own community to finance this devastation. Brenda's attorney, a visibly anxious associate from Payton and Associates, attempted to portray me as a radical environmentalist obstructing legitimate progress. His voice quavered as he asserted that the concrete channeling was essential flood control infrastructure, approved by qualified professionals. Then, Kate played the recordings. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as Brenda's voice echoed through the space, offering bribes and threatening Martha's livelihood. Audible gasps could be heard from the gallery when the secret HOA meeting recording laid bare her true intentions: to drive out incompatible residents in order to inflate property values for her real estate enterprise. Your Honor, Kate stated. The defendant's own words demonstrate that this was never about flood control. This was about wielding HOA power to carry out an ethnic and economic purge of long-standing residents. My testimony was direct and clear. 30 years of expertise in flood control, explained in a way that a jury could readily grasp. I presented the judge with my grandfather's 1973 engineering report, which had predicted with uncanny accuracy what would occur when concrete was substituted for natural flood absorption. Computer-generated animations illustrated how the channel was directing 400% more water towards the HOA homes during peak flow conditions. However, the most dramatic moment arrived when Dr. Rodriguez presented real-time flood monitoring data. The creek's flow was nearing record highs as we sat in the courtroom, and the concrete channel was behaving precisely as my grandfather had foreseen, like a high-pressure fire hose aimed at million-dollar basements. Your Honor, Dr. Rodriguez testified. This concrete installation has created an immediate danger to public safety. During peak flood conditions, which we are currently experiencing, the water velocity in that channel will reach levels capable of destabilizing foundations. The judge declared a 30-minute recess when the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency for our region. Court officials evacuated the lower level of the courthouse as emergency services were dispatched to address flooding incidents throughout the valley. When the court reconvened, Brenda appeared as though she had encountered her own apparition. Her lawyer was nervously checking his phone, likely receiving updates from the disaster zone she herself had engineered. It was at this moment that Kate delivered the most impactful statement of the trial. Your Honor, while we have been in session this morning, the defendant's concrete channel has begun to flood the very homes it was meant to safeguard. Emergency crews are currently pumping water from basements in Willowbrook Estates, while Mr. Brennan's property, situated upstream and at a naturally higher elevation, remains entirely unaffected. Live television footage from news helicopters confirmed the beautiful irony of the situation. Water was accumulating behind Brenda's concrete obstruction, causing the very foundation flooding that my grandfather's engineering had successfully prevented for 70 years. Million-dollar residences were now situated in lakes of murky water. While my humble workshop on higher ground remained completely dry, Brenda's public breakdown was captured by every camera in the courtroom. She accused me of engineering the flood emergency, alleged that environmental groups had somehow manipulated the weather, and insisted on federal protection from what she termed my eco-terrorist conspiracy. Judge Blackwood's patience wore thin, evaporating like dew in the morning sun. Ms. Hartwell, you will either regain your composure or be held in contempt. The court has heard sufficient evidence. During the lunch recess, FBI agents executed additional warrants, confiscating financial documents pertinent to the racketeering investigation. Concurrently, EPA enforcement officers were cordoning off the concrete work sites as crime scenes. Investigators from the Colorado Attorney General's office arrived, presenting evidence of widespread HOA fraud that implicated multiple developments across the state. The afternoon proceedings were a mere formality. Judge Blackwood delivered a comprehensive ruling in my favor on all charges: Clean Water Act violations, water rights infringement, fraud, conspiracy, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. She mandated the immediate dismantling of all concrete, a complete restoration of the creek, and awarded damages amounting to $750,000, which covered attorney fees and punitive awards. More significantly, she set a legal precedent that safeguards water rights from HOA overreach, establishing a legal framework that other homeowners can utilize to combat similar forms of abuse. The press conference held outside the courthouse had the atmosphere of a victory rally. Environmental lawyers hailed it as a groundbreaking case. Veterans organizations honored me with a Community Service Award. Children from the high school environmental club presented Martha with hand-drawn thank you notes. However, the true triumph was more fundamental than legal precedents or media acclaim. That evening, as emergency crews pumped floodwater from Brenda's basement and contractors readied themselves to free my grandfather's creek, I stood on the back porch with Martha, listening to the water flow where it was meant to be. "Justice," she remarked, "sounds like running water." And for the first time in months, that water was running unimpeded. 6 months later, you wouldn't recognize Cottonwood Creek, where ugly concrete once held flowing water captive. A natural channel now meanders through restored banks adorned with native willows and wildflowers that bloom as if in nature's own celebration. The sound that awakens me each morning is no longer the harsh rasp of water against concrete. It is the gentle gurgle of a creek that has rediscovered its true self. The restoration evolved into a collective community project that would have filled my grandfather with pride. Local contractors contributed equipment and manpower. High school students planted native flora as part of a biology class project. And even some guilt-stricken former HOA members appeared with shovels and checkbooks in hand. The aroma of fresh soil mingled with mountain water has supplanted the industrial odor of concrete dust and diesel fumes. Martha and I now spend our evenings strolling along the rejuvenated banks, observing the native trout that have made their way back to spawn in the gravel beds that were, for months, buried, the feel of smooth river stones beneath our boots, the sight of children angling where concrete ditches once marred the terrain. It is even better than my grandfather could have ever envisioned, for it has been revived through the united efforts of a community rather than the singular vision of one man. The wider effects of our efforts spread outwards like ripples from a stone cast into calm water. The Colorado legislature enacted what environmental organizations dubbed Dale's Law, a piece of legislation that fortifies property rights against the overreach of HOAs and mandates environmental impact assessments prior to any alterations of natural waterways. Law schools from Stanford to Harvard now include the Brennan Creek case in their curriculum as a prime example of citizen-led environmental enforcement. The financial restitution was both comprehensive and gratifying. The $750,000 judgment not only covered the entire restoration and all legal expenses, but also left a sufficient surplus to create the William Brennan Environmental Engineering Scholarship at Colorado State University. The inaugural recipient was Sarah Olivia, who, after graduating from law school, joined the EPA's Enforcement Division, continuing the battle against environmental offenders. Brenda's downfall was almost anticlimactic. Following the high drama of the courtroom, she entered a guilty plea to federal fraud charges and was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security prison, which will be followed by 3 years of supervised probation and full restitution to the victims of the HOA. Her real estate license was permanently taken away. Her assets were liquidated to cover damages, and her family moved to Florida, where they now lead a quiet life and refrain from discussing their Colorado experiences. The owner of the concrete company was given a 2-year sentence and fined $2 million for environmental violations. 3 former members of the HOA board received probation and were assigned community service. dedicating their weekends to the restoration of damaged waterways throughout the state. Edwin Kowalski was elected as the new HOA president by a unanimous vote and has since introduced new bylaws that necessitate an environmental review for all future projects. But the most profound change was more significant than legal triumphs or monetary settlements. Willowbrook transformed from a gated enclave of wary strangers into a genuine neighborhood, where residents know one another's names and collaborate on shared challenges. The yearly Creek Festival now attracts thousands of attendees, who come to witness what grassroots environmental activism can achieve when ordinary citizens decide they have had enough. My workshop has reverted to its original function of restoring classic motorcycles and instructing local youths on the workings of engines, the principles of water flow, and the significance of confronting bullies. The walls are now adorned with letters of gratitude from homeowners engaged in similar struggles. Across the nation, requests for guidance and invitations to speak at environmental symposiums. Martha has gone back to teaching, incorporating new lesson plans on watershed preservation and citizen engagement. Her students' science fair entries on creek restoration have garnered awards at regional competitions and have attracted the notice of university researchers who are examining community-driven environmental solutions. The Cottonwood Creek Redemption Project has since become a template that is being emulated in numerous communities where developers and HOAs have inflicted damage on natural waterways. Federal agencies now utilize our case study in their training materials, illustrating how citizen enforcement can achieve what underfunded government bodies sometimes cannot. Just last week, I received a phone call from a homeowner in Arizona who is confronting an almost identical situation of creek destruction at the hands of her HOA. As I heard her story, concrete channeling, misappropriated funds, campaigns of intimidation, I came to understand that this struggle extends far beyond a single creek in Colorado. Martha and I are now contemplating whether to assist other communities that are facing similar challenges, potentially transforming our workshop into a hub for environmental self-defense. But for the time being, it is sufficient to sit on the back porch as the sun sets, listening to grandfather's creek sing its age-old melody while Martha reads aloud from letters sent by supporters from all over the country. Home is not merely the location of your house. It is the place where your principles are upheld and your community flourishes. So, I extend this challenge to you. If you have an HOA horror story developing in your own neighborhood, please share it in the comments section. Below, you may be pleasantly surprised by the number of legal avenues that are actually available to you when petty despots attempt to ruin something beautiful. And please remember to click the subscribe button, because next week we will be delving into the case of the HOA that attempted to prohibit vegetable gardens and the 73-year-old grandmother who successfully fought back using the Constitution. At times, the most effective form of retaliation against bullies is a combination of patience, thorough preparation, and allowing nature to reclaim what has always been rightfully hers. We are grateful for your time with us on End for HOA, where HOA cars finally get checked. If you found today's drama enjoyable, please click the like button, comment on your favorite moment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you can be the first to see our next HOA confrontation.